The wind at 20 stories high doesn't howl, it whispers. It's a cold, clinical sound, like the hiss of an oxygen tank in a room where hope has already left. I stood on the very edge of the St. Jude's Memorial rooftop, my toes hanging over the concrete lip. Below me, Chicago was a blur of golden veins and pulsing headlights, a city that didn't care that Dr. Bennett Hayes was about to become a statistic. My hands, the same hands that had performed 300 successful appendectomies and stabilized a dozen trauma victims, were shaking so violently I had to shove them into my pockets. I looked down at my white coat. It was stained. Not with blood, I could handle blood, but with the invisible ink of a ruined reputation. Murderer. That was the word the headlines used. The junkie surgeon. That's what the morning talk shows called me after the toxicology report came back, positive for opioids I had never touched in my life. I closed my eyes, and all I could see was Mrs. Gable's face. She had looked at me with so much trust before I put the mask over her face. "I'm in good hands, aren't I, Dr. Hayes?" she had whispered. I told her yes. I promised her she'd wake up. She didn't. And when the internal investigation began, the hospital didn't look for a medical error. They looked for a scapegoat. They found a vial of fentanyl in my locker. Within 48 hours, my license was suspended. Within a week, my fiancée, Sarah, had packed her bags. I didn't do it, I whispered into the wind. But the wind didn't believe me. No one did. I took one last breath, the kind that burns your lungs, because you know it's the final one. I leaned forward. I wanted the silence. I let go of the railing, my body tipping into the empty, dark maw of the city. The fall felt like an eternity. And then, right before the impact, there was a flash of blinding sterile white. My ears popped. The roar of the wind vanished, replaced by the rhythmic mechanical thump hiss of a ventilator and the distant melodic chime of a nurse's station. I snapped my eyes open. I wasn't on the pavement. I was sitting in the residence break room of St. Jude's. I looked at my wrist. My watch read 6:02 a.m. The date on the digital face made my blood turn to ice. October 14th. That was 5 years ago. Bennett. "You okay, man? You look like you just saw a ghost." I bolted upright, knocking my coffee cup over. Standing in the doorway was Marcus. "Big day today, buddy. Your first lead on a major case." I couldn't breathe. I stumbled toward the bathroom, staring into the mirror. The man looking back at me was young and vibrant. The badge clipped to his chest read, Bennett Hayes, M.D., surgical resident. It was the morning of the Gable surgery. Somehow the universe had hit the reset button. It meant Mrs. Gable was currently in room 412. It meant she was alive. And it meant I had 12 hours before I killed her. I navigated the familiar hallways, every turn bringing back a surge of déjà vu, so strong it made me dizzy. Then I saw him. Walking down the hall was Dr. Lawrence Kyle, the chief of surgery. In my previous life, he was the one who sat me down and told me he had to let me go. "Ah, Bennett," Kyle said, flashing that charismatic fatherly smile. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "The big day. Mrs. Gable is a lovely woman. Take care of her. Show them why I chose you for this residency." I looked into his eyes, bright blue and seemingly full of wisdom. Now, looking at him with the knowledge of my own destruction, I felt a shiver of pure, unadulterated dread. I continued to room 412. Mrs. Gable was sitting up in bed, working on a half-finished blue sweater. "Dr. Hayes, you're early." I grabbed the railing of her bed just to stay upright. "I'm going to take very good care of you," I said, and this time it was a vow. I headed straight for the computer terminals. In my first life, the evidence showed I had requested an extra dose of fentanyl at 10:15 a.m. It was now 8:45 a.m. I stared at the screen and saw something that made my heart stop. There was already a request in the system, a pre-dated order for a high-dose anesthetic cocktail. and the digital signature was a ghost signature, Tier 1 authorization required. Lawrence Cale was at the top of that list. I realized then that this wasn't just a medical error. Someone wanted Mrs. Gable dead, and they wanted me to take the fall. I went back to her digital file and saw a secondary insurance provider called the Aegis Group. I headed toward OR4 and noticed a small black device tucked behind the primary monitor, a bridge to bypass the local encrypted network. Looking for something Bennett. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Eris Thorne. He gave me a look that wasn't clinical, it was predatory. "The surgery is at 11 o'clock. Don't be late." I pulled the device out and tucked it into my sock. I headed to the medical records basement and found a loose slip of paper in Mrs. Gable's physical file. A handwritten note in Cale's script, "Patient 412, match confirmed. Proceed with long-term monitoring." I reached the surgical floor and saw the orderlies wheeling Mrs. Gable toward the OR. I walked into the scrub room, the hot spray hitting my skin. I finished scrubbing and stepped into the OR. Dr. Lawrence Cale was sitting in the gallery, watching me like a hawk. I looked at the anesthesia machine. The black device was gone, but the software was already tainted. "Patient is prepped," the nurse said. I took a deep breath and reached out my hand. "Scalpel," I said. I lowered the blade toward the skin, but my eyes were on the anesthesia monitor watching the digital numbers begin their slow, controlled climb toward a lethal dose. My hand didn't tremble. I made the first cut as the first alarm began to hum a low warning note that only I seemed to hear. The metallic scent of blood met the sterile chill of the room, a familiar contrast that usually centered me. But today, every beep of the vitals monitor sounded like a countdown. My eyes flickered from the incision to the digital readouts on the anesthesia tower. The numbers were creeping upward: 1.2, 1.4, 1.8% of the sevoflurane gas. It was subtle, a slow-motion poisoning that most surgeons would overlook in the heat of a complex procedure. "Steady, Bennett." Dr. Lawrence Cale's voice crackled through the intercom. He sounded like a proud father, but to my ears it was the hiss of a snake. I didn't answer. I could feel the device I'd stashed in my sock, pressing against my ankle, a hard plastic reminder that the man praising me was currently trying to ghost sign my career into an early grave. The anesthesiologist, a young resident named Miller, was staring at his clipboard, oblivious. "Check the gas flow, Miller," I said. "Everything's in the green, Dr. Hayes," he replied. He was wrong. She was drifting toward a depth she might never return from. I needed a diversion. "Suction," I barked. "Miller, I need you to drop the pressure, now." As Miller leaned over, I gave a sharp tug on the auxiliary data cable, triggering a communication fault. The monitor let out a sharp wail. "Switch to manual override," I commanded. From the gallery, I saw Cale stand up, his brow furrowed. He knew I was meddling. The next hour was a blur of sweat and high-stakes improvisation. I finished the surgery with a speed that bordered on reckless. I wasn't just repairing a valve, I was racing a digital assassin. When Mrs. Gable was wheeled out, I skipped the post-op lounge and ducked into a stairwell. "Bennett." Dr. Eris Thorne stepped out from the shadows. "Most residents would have panicked when the monitor failed. You acted like you knew it was coming." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You found the bridge, didn't you?" Thorne whispered. "I'm the one who's been trying to figure out why the mortality rate in OR4 is 3% higher than anywhere else." Thorne handed me a tablet. "Look at the pharmacy logs, not the ones on the main server." I scrolled through encrypted entries. My name appeared dozens of times attached to high-risk medication pools. It was a meat grinder, designed to protect the hospital's elite, while they experimented with off-label drug trials funded by the Aegis Group. Thorne explained they needed Mrs. Gable to never wake up for a post-mortem biopsy. Cale likes to break the things he can't own, Thorne said. He decided to use you up and discard you. I told him I'd go to the police, but Thorne laughed bitterly. The chief of police sits on the hospital's board. You're playing a game against people who own the board. I spent the afternoon in a fever dream of corporate espionage at a terminal in the boiler room. I mapped the Aegis Group's digital footprint, searching for links to Coyle. I was so deep in the data that I didn't hear the door open. Working late, Dr. Hayes. It was Henderson, the guard, who had escorted me out in my previous life. The chief wants to see you. Now. The ride to the top floor felt like a journey to the gallows. In his dim study, Dr. Lawrence Cale sat with a glass of amber liquid. St. Jude's is a pillar, Cale said softly. And sometimes, that foundation requires sacrifices. Like Mrs. Gable. It's murder, I spat. Cale sighed. I thought you were someone who could understand the burden of command, but you're still worried about the rules. He stood up and demanded the device from the OR, offering to make me the youngest attending in history. And if I don't? I asked. Kyle smiled terrifyingly, threatening a rigged toxicology screen. I don't have the device. I lied. Kyle's smile faded. Go home, Bennett. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. I walked out knowing I was being followed. I doubled back to the locker room and found a planted bottle of oxycodone in my locker. They were accelerating the timeline. I stuffed the bottle into a biohazard bag and ran bursting through the emergency exit into the humid night air. I dived into an alleyway, a black SUV trailing me. I reached an old subway entrance and vanished into the crowd, eventually heading to a Chinatown internet cafe run by a former patient, Mr. Chen. I sat in a booth and plugged the black device into a PC. Folders popped up staggering offshore payments from the Aegis Group. Then I found a hidden video file from OR4. I hit play and saw myself 5 years ago over Mrs. Gable. But the video continued after I was let out. I saw Dr. Kyle enter, lean over her, and inject a vial directly into her carotid artery. He looked at the camera and smiled. It was an execution. The bell at the front jingled. We're looking for a friend, Henderson's voice boomed. I looked at the screen, 80% download. I heard a thud and Mr. Chen's voice rising. 95%. 98%. Download complete. I ripped the device out just as Henderson ripped the curtain aside. I twisted away, dived through a back window, and sprinted into the darkness. I ran until I reached the river, clutching the device. A text arrived. You can't run forever. Come back. I deleted it. They thought I was a victim, but I had already seen the end of this story. I started walking back toward the only place they wouldn't expect me, the hospital. I reached the service entrance and used a stolen keycard. The light flickered from red to green with a soft mechanical click. The magnetic strip of the stolen keycard hissed through the reader, a tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness of the loading dock. I slipped through the heavy steel door, just as the red light blinked back to life, locking the world of shadows and sirens behind me. I wasn't just back in St. Jude's. I was inside the belly of the beast that had swallowed me whole once before. The service corridors were a stark contrast to the marble-floored lobbies upstairs. I kept my head down, my torn lab coat balled up in my hand. I was a ghost in the machine, moving through the veins of the hospital toward the one place where Cale's power was absolute, the executive archives. I waited until an orderly vanished around the corner before I took the freight elevator to the 4th floor. My destination was the Quality Assurance Wing, a place where mistakes were buried under layers of legal jargon. I reached the heavy glass door of the records room and used a small electronic bypass I'd constructed to disengage the lock. I slipped inside and went straight to the terminal marked Chief of Surgery, Private Audit. I plugged in the device and began the synchronization. 10%. 15%. You always were a fast learner, Bennett. but you never learned when to stop. The voice came from the speakers on the terminal. Cale's face appeared in a high-definition video feed. He was watching me in real time. "Did you really think I wouldn't track Thorne's card?" Kyle asked, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. I whispered, "You killed them, Mrs. Gable. All of them." Kyle leaned back. "I'm a Surgeon Bennett. Sometimes you have to excise the necrotic tissue to save the body." I shouted that I had the video and financial records, but Kyle just laughed. I looked down and saw the synchronization had stopped at 42%. A message popped up, "Remote wipe initiated." The device began to smoke its circuits, fried by a high-voltage pulse. "Security is already on their way," Kyle said. "They have orders to use whatever force is necessary to subdue an intruder." I grabbed a fire extinguisher and hurled it through the glass window overlooking the atrium. The glass shattered with a roar. I didn't think. I climbed onto the ledge and jumped. It was only 15 feet to the third-floor ledge, but pain exploded in my arm upon impact. Above me, flashlights from the security team searched the room. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself through an unlocked window into the pediatric wing. I was a wounded animal now, but I still had one thing Cale didn't realize: I had the handwritten note. It was physical evidence that couldn't be wiped remotely. I found a janitor's closet and ducked inside, using a floor rag to tie a sling for my throbbing arm. I knew I couldn't leave the hospital, so I went to the one place Kyle wouldn't look: the morgue. I pushed the double doors open and scrolled through the digital logbook. Gable Clara. Station 4. I walked over to the drawer, my hand trembling. I pulled the sheet back and looked at the spot where Cale had injected the toxin. There was a tiny puncture mark. If I could get a sample of that tissue, I'd have him. I picked up a scalpel, but a voice stopped me. "What are you doing, Bennett?" Standing in the doorway was Dr. Eris Thorne, flanked by 2 FBI agents. "I'm getting the truth," I said. One agent held up a badge explaining they had been monitoring the Aegis group for months. When I told them Cale had destroyed the device, Thorne stepped closer. "He didn't destroy the backup bridge. It mirrored the data to a private server I set up. I just needed you to draw his fire." I stared at Thorne, realizing I was a pawn for both sides. "You let me jump from the 3rd floor," I whispered. Thorne admitted he needed Cale to believe he had won. The agents confirmed the video from Chen's was already being broadcasted to the Department of Justice, but they needed the location of the real match list. "It's at his estate," I said. "The summer house in Lake Forest." I walked out of the morgue, leaving Thorne in the cold. I made my way to the lobby as the morning shift arrived. I walked out the front doors into the crisp morning air and sat on a stone bench watching the chaos unfold. I saw Dr. Lawrence Coyle being led out in handcuffs. He stopped, his eyes meeting mine. "You were always my best student, Bennett," he whispered. I didn't say a word. I just watched him go. Soon Sarah sat down beside me and took my hand. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you," she whispered. "I wouldn't have believed me either," I replied. The weight on my chest was gone, but I wasn't the same man. I stood up, turning my back on St. Jude's. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not going back inside." We started walking as the morning bells began to ring. I pulled out the handwritten note one last time, tore it into 1,000 tiny pieces, and let the wind carry them away. As we stepped into the light, I realized the reset hadn't been about saving Mrs. Gable or stopping Cale. It had been about saving myself. The story was over, but the life was just beginning. I took Sarah's hand and walked into the crowd, leaving the shadows behind. I felt the sun on my face, a beautiful heat that told me I was finally truly awake. I looked up at the sky, whispered, "Thank you," and then I was gone. The morning sun didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. As Sarah's fingers laced through mine, I watched the strobe lights of the police cruisers fade, taking Dr. Lawrence Kyle toward a prison cell he had spent decades building for others. My shoulder screamed with every breath, but the physical pain was grounded. It was real, unlike the gaslit nightmare I'd inhabited for 5 years. "Bennett, your arm," Sarah whispered. "We need to get you to an ER. Not St. Jude's. Anywhere else." I looked back at the hospital's glass facade. "No more hospitals today, Sarah." "Not yet." I knew the FBI had Kyle and Thorne had the data, but there was one final string to pull. The Legacy Project was a physical manifestation of Kyle's hubris located at his Lake Forest estate. If the federal agents moved too slowly, his legal team would sanitize the property. I led Sarah to her car for the silent drive north. At the estate, I told her to wait at the end of the driveway and call the agents if I wasn't back in 20 minutes. I bypassed the main gate and headed for the detached carriage house, Kyle's sanctuary. I shattered a window and pulled myself inside, the agony in my arm nearly blacking me out. Inside, I found a standalone server and a drawer of external drives. I grabbed the one marked 2026 matches. "I expected the FBI, Bennett. I didn't expect you to have the stomach for a burglary." It was Dr. Eris Thorne. He wasn't wearing his lab coat, and the limp I'd seen in the hospital was gone. It had been an affectation. He held a silenced pistol. "Kyle is a dinosaur," Thorne replied. "The Aegis Group doesn't need Kyle anymore. They need someone younger. Someone with a debt of gratitude." The realization hit me. Thorne hadn't been working to stop the culling. He was working to inherit it. He had used me to clear out his predecessor. "You let me do the dirty work," I whispered. Thorne aimed the pistol at my chest. "Give me the drive. You can go back to your life. You'll be famous. You'll be rich." I held up the drive, asking about the people scheduled to die next month. Thorne shrugged, calling it a noble trade. The rage I had felt on the rooftop calcified into resolve. "You think I'm the same man who stood on that ledge," I said. "You think I'm afraid of the end." Instead of handing him the drive, I smashed it against the mahogany desk, shattering the magnetic platters inside. Thorne lunged and fired. The bullet grazed my shoulder, but I tackled him into the glass cabinets of Kyle's medical museum. We tumbled into a heap of antique scalpels and broken jars of formaldehyde. I didn't fight like a doctor. I fought like a man who had already died once. I jammed my thumb into his leg and brought a heavy brass microscope down on his wrist, sending the gun skittering away. I didn't kill him. Death was too easy an escape for men like him. I heard the sirens then. Sarah had made the call. I crawled away from Thorne as the police arrived at the Legacy, now nothing but dust. The following weeks were a whirlwind of grand jury testimonies and recovery. St. Jude's Memorial was shuttered and its board members indicted. Dr. Lawrence Kale took his own life in his cell, a final act of cowardice. Eris Thorne turned state's evidence, but the Aegis Group vanished into offshore shell companies. I stood in the cemetery on a gray Tuesday, placing blue cornflowers on the grave of Clara Gable. "We caught them, Clara," I whispered. "You weren't a sacrifice. You were the light that showed me the way back." I walked out of the cemetery with my arm in a permanent sling, a souvenir of the night I chose to live. I wasn't Dr. Bennett Hayes anymore. My license was restored, but I didn't want the white coat. I found work at a small community clinic on the south side, a place with linoleum floors and bad coffee, but where patients had names and families. One evening, I saw a young, overwhelmed resident on the corner. I put a hand on his shoulder. "Just remember, the person on the table is the only big picture that matters. Everything else is just wind." He looked at me confused, but grateful, and I started my walk home. The Chicago wind didn't whisper about ledges anymore. It carried the roar of life. I reached my apartment where Sarah was waiting. I'd been given a second chance not to be a hero, but to be human. I had traded the heights of the rooftop for the ground beneath my feet. I opened the door and stepped inside a man finally at peace with the silence. The story of the doctor who died was over. The story of the man who lived had just begun. I felt the sun on my face the next morning, a searing, beautiful heat. I looked up at the sky, whispered, "Thank you," and then I was gone.